Hey guys! Tonight, we begin with something far more complex than heroes and villains. We're diving into the historical earthquake that reshaped an entire continent and sowed seeds of misunderstanding that still echo today: the Crusades. Forget the Hollywood epics and tales of valiant knights. Forget the romanticized notions of pure faith and divine quests. The truth? It's far bloodier, far more desperate, and infinitely more human. So, before we plunge into this crucible of faith and fury, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support helps me dig deeper into these unvarnished truths. Now, let's peel back the layers of myth. When you hear Crusades, what comes to mind? Probably shining armor, noble kings, perhaps a valiant Richard the Lionheart, all marching under the banner of the cross to liberate the Holy Land. A grand, epic struggle between good and evil. A straightforward story of pious Europeans defending their faith. Right? Wrong. So incredibly, tragically, historically wrong. Imagine you're a peasant in the 11th century Europe. This isn't the idyllic, quaint village scene from a children's book. This is a world where famine stalks your village like a grim reaper. Your lord, a minor nobleman with more ambition than sense, demands taxes you can barely pay, often in grain you don't have. You're utterly dependent on the fickle weather for your next meal. Life expectancy is barely 30 if you're lucky enough to survive childhood. Your teeth are rotting from the inside out, a constant, dull ache you've learned to live with. You live in a hovel shared with the livestock for warmth, the air thick with the smell of smoke, animal waste, and unwashed bodies. The concept of hygiene is a foreign language if you even knew what a foreign language was. Your clothes are stained, stiff, and scented like a compost pile that's been left to marinate in a pigsty. Most people haven't bathed in months, possibly years. You rarely leave your village, and the world beyond is a terrifying, unknown expanse. Then a charismatic preacher arrives, perhaps a fiery monk or a wandering orator like Peter the Hermit. He doesn't just promise salvation, he promises a literal escape. He paints vivid pictures of a distant, exotic land overflowing with milk and honey, a land of riches, of fertile ground for the taking. He tells you that God himself desires this. He promises divine forgiveness for all your sins, a direct ticket to paradise, if you take up the cross and go east to reclaim Jerusalem from the infidels. Sounds like a good deal, right? A ticket out of misery with God on your side and eternal reward waiting. What do you have to lose? Everything and nothing at all. You have almost nothing in this life anyway. This wasn't just a call to piety, it was a desperate gamble for the desperate, a spiritual and material Hail Mary pass for an entire continent. The real purpose of the First Crusade wasn't a singular, pure religious ideal. It was a volatile stew of motivations. Fervent faith, yes, but also crushing poverty, land hunger, social unrest, and a hefty dose of political maneuvering. Let's talk about that political maneuvering. The call to arms came from Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095. His rallying cry, Deus vult, God wills it, sparked a wildfire across Europe. But the Pope wasn't just rallying the faithful, he was a shrewd political operator. He wanted to assert the dominance of the Latin Western Church over the Greek Eastern Church, which had split from Rome just decades earlier. He wanted to channel the destructive energies of Europe's notoriously violent feudal lords, who spent their days warring with each other, outwards towards a common enemy. And he responded to a desperate plea from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, whose empire was being chipped away by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. Alexios wasn't asking for a full-scale invasion. He was asking for mercenaries, for help defending his borders. He got an unstoppable, largely uncontrollable, religiously fanatic horde instead. So you, our hypothetical peasant, strap on whatever rusty farm tool you can convince yourself is a weapon. Your armor might be a leather tunic, if you're lucky. You join a swelling tide of humanity. Men, women, children, prostitutes, criminals, monks, all convinced they are marching towards God's kingdom. This is not a disciplined army. It's a chaotic, often starving mob. Peter the Hermit, one of the leaders of this People's Crusade, wasn't a general. He was a fiery, barefoot preacher. His army was less a military force and more a ravenous, desperate stampede. The journey to the Holy Land was less a military campaign and more a gruesome gauntlet of survival. You start walking, for months, through unfamiliar, often hostile lands. Your food runs out. You start to scavenge. Then you start to take. From anyone, Christian or otherwise. This isn't a holy pilgrimage yet, it's a desperate march, marked by plunder, starvation, and shocking violence, often against their fellow Christians and Jewish communities along the way. The very people who vow to protect fellow Christians in the East often massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland, driven by anti-Semitism and a desire for plunder to fund their holy journey. Irony or just human nature unleashed when given divine justification? Often the line was blurry, if it existed at all. This initial wave, the People's Crusade, was largely wiped out by the Turks long before the main. More organized armies even arrived. It was a disaster, a testament to the raw, untamed passion and utter lack of logistical planning that fueled the early Crusades. Next time you hear a leader use powerful, emotionally charged rhetoric to rally support for a distant cause, remember the echoes of Deus Vult. Remember the desperation, the promises of salvation, the lure of riches, and the projection of internal violence outwards. The tactics haven't changed as much as we'd like to believe. The Crusades were born not just of faith, but of famine, fear, and a burning desire for something more, anything more, than the brutal reality of 11th century Europe. The first wave of Crusaders, this chaotic mixture of faith and desperation, finally pushed east. When they reached the prosperous, sophisticated lands of the Byzantine Empire and then the powerful Muslim caliphates, they encountered a civilization far more advanced and complex than their own. And this collision, born of such complex and often contradictory motives, was just the beginning of a conflict that would last for centuries. So, how did the East react to this shock and awe arrival? And in this first bloody contact, how were the seeds of misunderstanding and hatred irrevocably sown? It only gets worse from here. The clash of worlds, Jerusalem and the sword's edge. So you've survived the desperate march of the People's Crusade, or perhaps you're one of the more organized knights, a hardened warrior arriving with the main force of the First Crusade. You've crossed continents, endured starvation, disease, and the wrath of locals. You've seen chaos and brutality on a scale most Europeans could barely imagine. Now, after months of relentless trekking, you stand before the dazzling, formidable cities of the East. These aren't the muddy, wooden villages of your homeland. These are centers of learning, trade, and architectural marvel, with towering stone walls that seem to defy gravity. But you haven't come to marvel. You've come to conquer. What you're about to witness and participate in will forever scar the collective memory of both civilizations. Let's dismantle another myth, the idea of the heroic liberation of Jerusalem. Forget the sanitized, glorious scenes of valor and triumph. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 was a bloodbath, a horror show that shocked even some contemporary observers and left an indelible stain on the Crusader legacy. This was not a moment of pure divine intervention. It was a brutal medieval siege culminating in a massacre that echoed for centuries. Imagine the siege of Antioch, which preceded Jerusalem. It lasted 8 agonizing months. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, thick with the smell of unburied bodies, human waste and decay. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, attracting swarms of flies and spreading disease like wildfire through both the besieging crusaders and the trapped defenders. You, as a crusader, are starving, freezing, baking in the sun, praying desperately. You're eating your horses, then the rats, then, well, let's just say starvation pushes men to unimaginable, horrifying acts. This isn't a heroic battle. It's a grindhouse of human suffering, a war of attrition where the elements and disease are as deadly as any sword. When the walls of Antioch were finally breached through treachery, the city fell, and then the gates of hell opened. The screams? You'd hear them in your nightmares for years to come, if you survived. Now, picture Jerusalem, the ultimate prize. For weeks, the Crusaders besieged the city. The heat is relentless, water is scarce, disease is rampant. Both sides are praying to their respective gods for victory. The Crusaders construct massive siege towers, pushing them towards the ancient walls. You're a Fatimid defender on the walls of Jerusalem. You look down at these ragged, desperate Europeans. They're not just invaders, they're an unholy storm, driven by a religious fury you can barely comprehend. They call you infidel, yet they slaughter and pillage with a ferocity that makes your stomach churn. You know what awaits if the walls fall. You fight with the desperate courage of someone defending not just a city, but a way of life, your family, your faith. You see the cross, a symbol of peace to them, as a banner of destruction. On July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders breached the walls. What followed was an act of savagery that cemented the West's image as brutal barbarians in the eyes of the Muslim world. The Crusaders, fueled by religious fervor, exhaustion, and a desperate desire for vengeance after their arduous journey, unleashed an orgy of violence. They swarmed through the streets, killing almost everyone they encountered, Muslims, Jews, and even many Eastern Christians, whom they couldn't distinguish or simply didn't care to. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilares wrote that in the temple and porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was a gruesome reality. Streets literally ran red. This leads us to a crucial contradiction. They came for the Holy Sepulchre, the very site of Christ's resurrection, a symbol of peace and new life. They found it through a river of blood built upon the corpses of thousands. Was this divine will or sheer, unadulterated barbarism dressed in the cross? How do you reconcile such profound religious piety with such utter, devastating brutality? The leaders of the First Crusade, figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, were complex men. Godfrey, a devout warrior, found himself leading a force that committed unspeakable acts in God's name. How do you reconcile that? The weight of those actions must have haunted them, or perhaps they simply rationalized it as righteous vengeance against the enemies of Christ. For them, the ends justified the horrific means. For the Muslims and Jews of Jerusalem, this was not a liberation. It was an apocalypse. It was a trauma that would be recounted for generations, fueling a deep and abiding resentment against the Franks, against the West. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a spiritual wound, a desecration of their holiest sites by those who claimed a shared Abrahamic heritage. Next time you hear of a conflict where both sides claim divine mandate, where both sides believe God is on their side, remember Jerusalem, 1099. Remember the bodies in the streets. Remember the unholy confluence of faith and fury. Remember that God's will can be a dangerous mask for human aggression, and that even the most sacred of sites can become ground zero for unspeakable horrors. True history, the unvarnished kind, rarely provides us with clean heroes or villains, but rather a messy, tragic reality where conviction and cruelty often walk hand in hand. Jerusalem had fallen. The Crusaders had carved out their new kingdoms in the heart of the Levant. But this was an alien presence, a Western island in a vast Muslim sea. How would this fragile, foreign entity survive? And how would the East, reeling from this catastrophic blow, eventually rally to strike back? The crucible had been lit, and the fires of misunderstanding were only just beginning to rage. The Crusader states, an alien presence in a familiar land. Jerusalem has fallen. The first wave of liberators has carved out new kingdoms in the heart of the Levant. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. You, whether a victorious knight, a hopeful settler, or a new merchant, are now living in what you call Outre-mer, the land beyond the sea. But this isn't Europe. This is a land of ancient cultures, advanced civilizations, and a deeply entrenched Islamic identity. How do you, a foreign conqueror, govern a people whose language, religion, and customs are utterly alien to you? How do you build a stable society when you are a tiny, often disliked minority surrounded by those you've just conquered? The answer, as you'll soon discover, is often with a heavy hand, a fair bit of adaptation, and a constant, simmering tension that could erupt at any moment. Let's dismantle another romantic notion. Forget the pristine castles and chivalrous tournaments of legend. Forget the idea that these were thriving, perfectly integrated Western outposts. The Crusader states were fortresses in a hostile sea, constantly on edge, always looking over their shoulder. Life here wasn't a fairy tale, it was a tightrope walk between survival and annihilation. They were fragile, dependent on constant resupply and reinforcement from Europe, and perpetually vulnerable. Imagine your daily life in a Crusader castle or town. Your armor is heavy, baking under the relentless sun, a far cry from the temperate climate of Europe. The local food is strange. Delicious spices, new fruits, unfamiliar dishes, but often causes stomach issues until you adapt. You learn a few words of Arabic or Greek, mostly for trade, issuing commands or, more often, threats. Every shadow could hide an assassin. Every village beyond your immediate control could be a trap. The beautiful, vibrant mosques and Orthodox churches stand as constant reminders that this is not your home, and everyone, from the local farmer to the distant emir, reminds you of that, silently or overtly. The air smells of spices, foreign perfumes, and, inevitably, the metallic tang of blood from the skirmishes that are a daily reality. You're never truly at peace, even within the thick walls of your formidable castle. Consider the challenges of governing. You're a new Frankish lord, perhaps given a castle and surrounding lands. You're expected to rule over a population that is overwhelmingly Muslim, Jewish, or Eastern Christian. Syriac, Greek, Armenian Orthodox. They speak different languages, follow different laws, and worship differently. You can't just impose European feudalism wholesale. So, what do? You adapt. You adopt some local customs. You implement a hybrid system of law. You rely on local administrators who understand the intricacies of the land. You're a Muslim farmer under Frankish rule. You pay your taxes, often heavier than before, but you keep your head down. They are barbarians, yes, these Franj as you call them, but they also bring a strange kind of order, sometimes even respecting existing property rights as long as you pay up. You are mostly allowed to practice your faith, though sometimes with restrictions or indignities. You just wish they'd stop trying to convert your children, or that their priests would stop shouting their strange liturgy so loudly. Your life is harder, more precarious, but life stubbornly goes on. This leads us to a profound contradiction at the heart of the Crusader states. They came to cleanse the land of infidels, to establish a purely Christian domain, yet almost immediately they found themselves making pragmatic compromises. They quickly learned they couldn't survive without interacting with the local populations. They employed Muslim mercenaries to fight their enemies, sometimes other Franks. They traded extensively with Muslim merchants, enriching themselves on the very goods they had once demonized. They adopted Eastern fashions, building styles, and even foods. Some learned Arabic and cultivated an appreciation for Eastern culture. This wasn't a pure, unblemished Western outpost. It was a messy, often contradictory blend of cultures, born out of necessity. Purity of faith or practical necessity. Often it was a volatile mix of both, fueling internal debates and exasperating newcomers from Europe. Take Baldwin I, for example, the first king of Jerusalem. He gave up his clerical vows, became Count of Edessa, then king. He was a pragmatic survivor, a military leader who understood the treacherous political landscape of the East better than many of his peers. He cultivated alliances with some Muslim leaders against others, a far cry from the pious, monolithic, holy warrior portrayed in legend. He was a king by necessity, not by pure divine right, in a land that largely rejected his very presence. On the other side, leaders like the young Saladin, growing up during this period, were observing. They saw this alien presence, this constant affront to Islamic sovereignty, and they began to plan. The seeds of a powerful counter-crusade were being sown in the hearts and minds of Muslim leaders across the region. Next time you see a global power trying to impose its will, its culture, its political system on a foreign land, remember the Crusader states. Remember how difficult it is to rule a people who fundamentally don't want you there, who resent your presence. Remember how seemingly civilizing missions can backfire spectacularly, how cultural purity often gives way to grudging, messy adaptation. The Crusader states were a stark lesson in the limits of military power when confronted with deep-rooted cultural identity and fierce local resistance. They were a testament to the fact that you can conquer a land, but you can't truly conquer a people. These Crusader states, against all odds, managed to cling on for over a century, a persistent thorn in the side of the Islamic world. But the East, though fragmented at first, was not sleeping. Powerful leaders like Saladin were rising, unifying disparate factions, learning from Frankish mistakes, and waiting for their moment. And one day, sooner than the Franks realized, they would deliver a definitive answer to the Crusader presence in these lands. And that answer, as history would soon reveal, would be drenched in blood. What would happen when the unified might of Islam finally turned its full force on these foreign kingdoms? The true storm was just beginning to gather. The Lion and the Sultan, Richard, Saladin, and the Third Crusade. The Crusader states are in peril. The grand unified Islamic counterattack that had been brewing for decades finally arrived under a brilliant, charismatic leader. Jerusalem has fallen once again, not to a chaotic mob, but to a figure of legendary stature. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. In the West, news of the Holy City's loss ignites a fresh, furious call to arms. Europe is shocked, enraged, and desperate to reclaim the ultimate prize. Enter Richard I, King of England, a man whose very name, the Lionheart, still conjures images of heroic chivalry, unmatched courage, and noble warfare. This is the Third Crusade, a clash of titans, and a period often drenched in romantic myth. But what if I told you the true story of Richard and Saladin is far more nuanced, far more brutal, and ultimately far more tragic than any ballad? Let's quickly dismantle the most pervasive myth of this period, the noble enmity and mutual respect between Richard and Saladin. Forget the movies where they share a respectful gaze across battlefields, exchanging gifts and admiring each other's virtue. They were fierce adversaries, ruthless generals, and their respect was born more of necessity, political maneuvering, and a shared understanding of military strategy than any genuine affection or personal bond. The stakes were too high for pleasantries. This was a war for absolute dominion, for the very soul of the Holy Land, and both were willing to be utterly ruthless to achieve their objectives. Imagine the sheer scale of the conflict. The siege of Acre, the opening act of the Third Crusade, was a meat grinder. It lasted over 2 years. Imagine months, years of relentless fighting in the searing, oppressive heat of the Levant. You're surrounded by the stench of death, of disease, of unwashed masses. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried, spreading dysentery and plague through both Crusader and Muslim camps. You're a soldier, Christian or Muslim, dying not from a glorious sword blow in single combat, but from dysentery, a poorly aimed arrow in a skirmish, or simply exhaustion and starvation. Glory? Where is the glory in that? It's a slow, agonizing grind of human suffering, punctuated by sudden, terrifying bursts of brutal violence. Richard finally arrives at Acre in 1191. He's a formidable warrior, a tactical genius, known for his ferocity and charisma. He immediately makes an impact. The city falls. But then comes the moment that shatters any illusion of chivalrous warfare. Saladin had agreed to pay a ransom and release Christian prisoners. Richard, impatient and perhaps mistrustful, believed Saladin was delaying. His response? A cold, calculated act of terror. He marched nearly 2,700 Muslim prisoners of war, men, women, and children, out of Acre, and had them all systematically executed in full view of Saladin's approaching army. The blood stained the very soil they claimed was holy. This wasn't an act of chivalry, it was a brutal message, a horrifying display of power designed to demoralize the enemy. You're an English archer, far from home, witness to this massacre. Your rations are dwindling. Your feet are bleeding. You hear the calls to prayer from the enemy camp and the fervent hymns from your own. You came for glory, for God. But this shakes your very soul. You wonder if God is truly on your side or if you're just a pawn in a brutal game played by kings. A game where the cost is measured in rivers of blood. This leads us to a profound contradiction for both leaders. Richard was often portrayed as a devout crusader, yet he was prone to immense rages, political blunders, and acts of shocking cruelty. His focus was often on his personal glory and his lands in France, not solely on the liberation of Jerusalem. Saladin, the champion of Islam, the great unifier, was a master strategist and a brilliant diplomat. He often found himself making tactical truces with the very Franks he vowed to expel, recognizing the need for pragmatism. He was devout, yes, but also a skilled politician who understood the necessity of compromise. The lines between good and evil, holy and profane, pious and pragmatic were constantly blurred for both figures. Richard was a tempest, a force of nature on the battlefield, but also a man whose ruthlessness alienated allies. Saladin was a master strategist, a unifier who managed to overcome deep internal divisions in the Muslim world. But he was also a man burdened by the immense responsibility of defending Islam and reclaiming its holiest sites. He felt the weight of expectation from his people, just as Richard felt the pressure from European Christendom. Neither was a caricature. Both were complex, flawed men, driven by a messy mix of ideology, ambition, and the brutal necessities of war. They commanded immense power, but were also prisoners of their own legends and the expectations of their age. Next time you hear of a great leader in a conflict, especially one presented in a simplified, heroic light, remember Richard and Saladin. Remember that even the most legendary figures are flesh and blood, driven by a messy mix of ideology, ambition, and the brutal necessities of war. Remember the Acre Massacre. True history rarely fits neatly into a hero or villain box. It reminds us that even great men are capable of great horrors, and that the demands of war often erode the very ideals they claim to uphold. The Third Crusade ultimately failed to recapture Jerusalem. Richard, after a brilliant military campaign marked by victories like Arsuf, eventually negotiated a truce that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the city but left it in Muslim hands. He soon returned to Europe, never to see the Holy Land again, dying years later from an arrow wound. Saladin, the great unifier, died shortly after Richard's departure, leaving behind a fragmented empire but a powerful legacy. However, this clash of titans, this era of intense fighting, only deepened the chasm of hatred and misunderstanding between East and West. The Crusader dream of a permanent Frankish presence in the Levant was fading, but the conflict itself was far from over. What transformations would the Crusader spirit undergo next? And how would the very nature of holy war begin to turn inward, consuming its own? The darker Crusades, children heretics in the shifting sands of faith. The initial fervor of the First Crusade gave way to the brutal pragmatism of the Third, a clash of empires that left Jerusalem still in Muslim hands. But what happens when the Holy War loses its way entirely? When the targets shift from the traditional infidel in the distant East to the heretic at home? When children are tragically sent to their doom by misguided faith and ruthless opportunism? And what happens when a grand crusade, ostensibly aimed at the Holy Land, ends in the unforgivable sacking and desecration of a fellow Christian city? This is where the story gets truly dark, truly desperate, and reveals the devastating perversion of a once unifying ideal. Let's quickly dismantle two more insidious myths: the unfortunate mistake of the Fourth Crusade and the innocent, pure faith of the Children's Crusade. Forget the idea that the sacking of Constantinople was a mere accident, a regrettable detour on the path to Jerusalem. It was instead a cynical convergence of Venetian ambition, financial greed, and a deep-seated, simmering resentment between Latin and Greek Christians, all culminating in an act of staggering sacrilege. And the Children's Crusade? That was less about divine intervention and more about mass delusion, horrific exploitation, and tragic preventable death. Imagine Constantinople in 1204, the jewel of the East, the bastion of Orthodox Christian culture, a city of unparalleled wealth and beauty, often considered the heart of Christendom after Rome's decline. Now, imagine it burning, priceless artifacts stolen, ancient libraries destroyed, magnificent churches like the Hagia Sophia desecrated, their altars smashed, their icons defiled, their sacred relics plundered. Women are violated, citizens murdered in the streets. The very crusaders who swore oaths to protect Christianity instead tore it apart from within, driven by greed and a raw, sectarian hatred for their Orthodox brethren. The stench of smoke, the cries of despair, the clatter of looting, it was a hell on earth, inflicted by fellow Christians. You're an Orthodox monk in Hagia Sophia. You watch in horror as Western knights, ostensibly fighting for God, smash icons, defile altars, and steal sacred vessels. These are not your saviors. They are destroyers, driven by a hatred you barely comprehend. The rift between East and West, already centuries old, just became an unbridgeable chasm of bitterness and betrayal. This event cemented Byzantine and, by extension, much of the Eastern Christian world's eternal distrust and contempt for the West. They never truly recovered, and it arguably set the stage for the eventual fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks centuries later. Then there's the truly heartbreaking tale, the Children's Crusade of 1212. Forget the stained glass windows depicting innocent children marching to glory, believing God would part the seas for them. This was a horrific example of mass delusion and exploitation, led by charismatic but ultimately deluded figures like Stephen of Cloyes in France and Nicholas of Cologne in Germany. Thousands of children and young adults, often desperate and impoverished, abandoned their homes, believing their pure faith alone would succeed, where sinful adults had failed. You're a child, barely 10 years old, swept up in a wave of religious ecstasy. You believe God will part the seas when you reach the Mediterranean. You walk for weeks, months, facing starvation, freezing cold, scorching heat. You become vulnerable to predatory adults, to human traffickers. You reach the sea, but it does not part. Your crusade ends not in glory or a miraculous victory, but in disease, death from exposure, or for many, being sold into slavery in Muslim lands by unscrupulous merchants who saw nothing but profit in their innocent faith. This wasn't a divine movement. It was a devastating testament to the power of false hope and the cruelty of human opportunism. This era highlights a crucial, chilling contradiction. The Crusades started with the lofty, if complex, goal of reuniting Christendom and defending it against an external foe. They quickly devolved into Western Christians gutting the very heart of Eastern Christianity and sending their own children to their doom. The hypocrisy was blatant, the moral bankruptcy undeniable, and the damage to the idea of a unified Christian Europe irreparable. Dissenters and heretics within Europe itself, like the Cathars in southern France, became targets of crusades, the Albigensian Crusade, showing how the violent machinery of holy war could easily be turned inwards, consuming its own. Consider the figures involved. Pope Innocent III, though he condemned the sack of Constantinople, was ultimately responsible for calling the Fourth Crusade and directing its focus on raising money. His initial outrage often rang hollow against the backdrop of the devastation. And the true mastermind behind the Fourth Crusade's disastrous redirection was the utterly pragmatic, almost blind, octogenarian Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo. He saw not a holy war, but a golden opportunity to expand Venetian maritime and commercial power at the expense of its rival, Constantinople. For him, God's will was secondary to Venice's profit. Next time you see a movement, religious or political, promise grand ideals, watch closely for the hidden agendas, the economic interests, and the potential for a holy cause to devolve into utter barbarism. Remember the Children's Crusade, a stark warning against mass delusion and the exploitation of innocence. Remember Constantinople, a chilling reminder of how even the most fervent beliefs can be corrupted by greed, sectarian hatred, and political maneuvering, tearing apart the very fabric they claim to defend. The lessons of this darker period of the Crusades are chillingly relevant, reminding us that the path to hell is often paved with good intentions, or at least intentions that began as good. The Fourth Crusade had shattered the unity of Christendom and left a gaping wound between East and West that never truly healed. The Children's Crusade was a tragic footnote, a symbol of hope tragically extinguished. The Crusader presence in the Levant continued, but it was increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate. What forces would finally sweep away the last vestiges of the Crusader dream? And how would the Islamic world, having endured centuries of Frankish aggression, deliver the final, decisive blow to this alien presence? The end was near, and it would be a brutal one. The fading flame, Mamluks, Mongols, and the end of an era. The initial fire of the Crusades has long since dimmed, replaced by a flickering, desperate flame. The grand ambitions of the First Crusade are a distant memory, replaced by a grim struggle for survival. The Crusader states cling precariously to the coast, a shadow of their former ambition, a string of isolated castles and fortified cities constantly under siege, both literally and figuratively. As the 13th century dawns, two new, formidable powers rise to challenge the last vestiges of Frankish presence in the East: the indomitable Mamluks of Egypt and the terrifying Mongol hordes from the steppe. This is the story of the twilight of the Crusades, a period of increasingly futile attempts, ultimate defeat, and the brutal reality that some dreams, however fervent, are destined to die. Let's quickly strip away any lingering romanticism about these later crusades. Forget the grand narratives of kings leading glorious charges or heroic last stands driven purely by faith. The later crusades were often plagued by infighting, poor leadership, dwindling supplies of genuine religious zeal, and a profound lack of understanding of the shifting power dynamics in the East. They were the death throes of a failing enterprise, not a resurgence of purpose. The energy, the resources, and the unified vision that propelled the First Crusade were long gone, replaced by fragmented efforts and desperate gambits. Imagine the last Crusader strongholds, cities like Acre, Tyre, and Sidon, in the late 13th century. These are heavily fortified, yes, but they are islands surrounded by a sea of increasingly unified and powerful Muslim forces. The roar of the Mamluk siege engines is a constant, terrifying symphony. You're a knight, hardened by decades of skirmishes living on edge. You know the Mamluks are coming. You know their resolve. You see the endless rain of arrows, the sappers undermining your walls, the sheer scale of their armies. You're fighting not for glory, but for sheer, desperate survival, knowing your world is crumbling around you. The sea behind you, once a lifeline to Europe, now offers no escape, only a cold, watery grave for those who attempt it. The siege of Acre in 1291 was the final, agonizing act. It was a prolonged, brutal assault that stretched over weeks. For the defenders, it was a living nightmare of starvation, disease, and relentless attacks. For the Mamluks, it was a meticulously planned campaign, a decisive blow to expel the Franks once and for all. When the city finally fell, the Mamluks, led by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, utterly annihilated it. There was no mercy, no quarter. Any remaining Crusader presence, any dream of a Latin kingdom in the East, was obliterated. Now, let's talk about an even greater cataclysm that swept through the East during this period: the Mongol invasions. These weren't just an army, they were a force of nature, a cataclysm that redefined warfare and empire. They swept through the Middle East in the mid-13th century, leaving cities like Baghdad was one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the world, as smoking ruins. Rivers literally ran black with ink from destroyed libraries and red with blood. Their terror was absolute, indiscriminate, indifferent to faith or lineage. They reminded everyone, Crusaders and Muslims alike, that there were forces far greater and far more brutal than any holy war. They briefly threatened both the Mamluks and the remaining Crusader states, creating a bizarre geopolitical chess match. This brings us to a crucial contradiction. The Crusaders, ostensibly fighting for Christendom against Islam, actually attempted to forge alliances with the utterly pagan Mongols against the Muslim powers. The irony is as bitter as it is obvious. The Holy War had become just another cynical political game, where expediency trumped religious purity. The initial, fervent goal of destroying Islam had mutated into desperate attempts to survive by any means necessary, even if it meant allying with a far more terrifying and destructive force. Consider the figures of this era. On the Muslim side, you have the rise of the Mamluk sultans, particularly Baybars. A former slave, a brilliant military strategist, Baybars rose to become a sultan who not only shattered the Mongol advance at Ayin Jalut, but also systematically dismantled the remaining Crusader strongholds. He was a ruthless pragmatist, a military genius who understood the shifting power dynamics far better than any Western king. For the Mamluks, this was not just a war, it was a liberation of their homeland, a decisive expulsion of unwanted invaders. On the Crusader side, figures like King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, represent the fading ideal. Despite his genuine piety and devout faith, his crusading efforts were disastrous. He was captured in Egypt during the Seventh Crusade and later died of disease during the Eighth Crusade in Tunisia. His failures underscore the increasing futility of the enterprise, the widening gap between the fervent desire of European monarchs and the grim reality on the ground in the East. Next time you hear of a long-standing conflict finally coming to an end, consider the human cost, the decades, even centuries of suffering. Remember the slow, agonizing whimper of the Crusades, not the bang. Remember that even the most fervent beliefs can buckle under the weight of superior organization, changing circumstances, and sheer attrition. The Crusades didn't end with a glorious final battle. They ended with the gradual, brutal dismantling of a foreign presence that ultimately could not sustain itself against unified, determined resistance. It's a powerful lesson in the limits of imperial ambition and the resilience of those who defend their homes. The Crusades had fundamentally reshaped the Middle East and Europe, but the physical presence of the Franks in the Levant was finally gone. However, this was not the end of the story. This centuries-long conflict, born of such complex motives and executed with such brutal efficiency, had irrevocably altered how East and West perceived each other. It left behind a profound and lingering legacy, a scar on the collective memory of two civilizations, fueling unresolved tensions and persistent misunderstandings. So, what exactly was this enduring legacy? And how does the long shadow of the Crusades continue to impact us, even today? The lingering shadow, legacy and misunderstanding in the modern world. The last Crusader castles crumbled centuries ago. The knights are dust, the sultans long gone, their empires having risen and fallen in the intervening years. Yet, the Crusades didn't just end, they left an indelible mark, a deep, complex scar on the collective psyche of both East and West. This isn't just ancient history confined to textbooks. It's a living legacy, shaping perceptions, fueling narratives, and often, tragically, fanning the flames of misunderstanding and conflict even today. Tonight, we uncover the enduring shadow of the Crusades and ask, how much of our present is still haunted by those holy wars? Let's quickly dismantle the final, most dangerous romantic myth, the idea that the Crusades were a noble clash of civilizations or a benign spread of Western influence that ultimately benefited the East. Forget the sepia-toned images of heroic knights bringing European enlightenment to a supposedly stagnant world. For many in the East, particularly in the Arab and Muslim world, the Crusades were the first brutal chapter in a long, painful history of Western invasion, exploitation, and ultimately colonialism. It wasn't about spreading civilization, it was about conquest, pure and simple, cloaked in religious zeal, and its memory became a powerful narrative of grievance and resistance. Imagine the cultural and psychological scars. The memory isn't just in ruined castles, it's embedded in historical narratives, in political rhetoric, in the very way East and West often view each other. The Crusades became a foundational story for both sides, a tale of valiant defense against barbarism for one, a bitter memory of invasion and desecration for the other. This isn't about blaming the dead for the present, it's about understanding how the past is weaponized, how it shapes perceptions that endure for centuries. You're a young person growing up in the Middle East today. You might learn about the Crusaders, the Franj, not just as ancient historical figures, but as a symbolic precursor to modern Western intervention. You see the historical threads that connect the medieval invasions to 19th century colonialism and even 21st century conflicts. The past isn't dead. It's a living, breathing political tool, shaping national identities and international relations. The fear of Western imposition, the distrust of Western motives, the memory of humiliation and betrayal, these are not simply recent phenomena. They have deep historical roots that stretch back to the Crusades. This brings us to a profound, unsettling contradiction. While the Crusades were devastating, they also inadvertently facilitated a massive transfer of knowledge from the sophisticated Islamic world to a comparatively underdeveloped Europe. Crusaders brought back not just spices and silks, but Arabic numerals, advanced astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and architectural innovations, laying crucial foundations for the European Renaissance. So, they were simultaneously a brutal barrier and an unexpected bridge, fostering both profound enmity and invaluable cultural exchange. Yet, the memory of the enmity often overshadowed the benefits of the exchange. Furthermore, consider how the Crusader image has been invoked through time. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European powers carved up the Ottoman Empire, many colonial figures explicitly referenced the Crusades. When British General Allenby entered Jerusalem in 1917, he famously declared, "Today the wars of the Crusades are completed." This wasn't a historical observation, it was a potent, politically charged statement, proudly reclaiming a lineage of Western conquest. Conversely, in modern times, extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS frequently invoke the Crusader label to describe the West, rallying their followers by framing contemporary conflicts as a continuation of these ancient holy wars against foreign invaders. When George W. Bush used the term crusade after 9/11, it sent shivers down the spine of millions in the Muslim world, even if his intent was simply to convey a broad moral struggle. It wasn't just a poor choice of words, it was a painful echo of a thousand-year-old trauma, confirming fears of a renewed Western holy war in the collective consciousness of many. Next time you encounter a sweeping generalization about the West or the East, about inherent conflicts between civilizations, remember the Crusades. Remember how easily history can be manipulated and weaponized. Remember that the past is never truly past, especially when its lessons of conquest, cultural collision, and bitter memory remain unaddressed. Understanding the messy, complicated, often brutal truth of the Crusades isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame to the distant past. It's about recognizing the deep roots of present-day misunderstandings, about acknowledging the trauma that still resonates, and about understanding how powerful narratives, once forged in blood and fire, continue to shape our world. The Crusades were a tragic testament to how easily faith can be corrupted by greed, how ideals can be twisted by ambition, and how deeply lasting the scars of invasion can be. They taught us that while men can build magnificent cathedrals and compose soaring hymns, they are equally capable of unspeakable cruelty in the name of God. To truly move forward, to bridge the divides that still separate us, we must first confront the unvarnished truth of our history, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. Only then can we hope to escape the lingering, toxic shadow of those holy wars.